Listen carefully, because what I'm about to reveal was never meant to reach your ears. Imagine this: a room glowing with candlelight, silver spoons clinking against porcelain, and the laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. These were the masters of Virginia's richest plantations, men whose hands never touched soil, yet whose fortunes were built on broken backs and stolen lives. They sat gathered inside the great dining hall of Willowbrook Estate, a place where power wore velvet coats and cruelty hid behind polished manners. That night, in September of 1847, 8 of the wealthiest men in the county lifted forks to their lips, savoring a dessert so exquisite they whispered it was fit for kings. Sweet golden honey cakes, infused with herbs plucked from the woodlands, their delicate flavor masking something else, something waiting, silent, hidden within every bite. By dawn, those same men were writhing in agony, their screams echoing through the marble halls, their bodies seizing, mouths foaming, as death claimed them one by one. Historians dismissed it as food poisoning. Newspapers buried the story. Records faded into dust. But that was no accident. The truth was sealed away, concealed like a cursed secret, because if it were told, it would unravel everything you thought you knew about power, justice, and revenge. At the center of this tale stands a woman named Judith Henley, an enslaved cook, known across the county for her unmatched talent in the kitchen. To the world, she was just another shadow in the grand plantation machine. But within her burned something the masters could never chain: memory, knowledge, and the will to turn sweetness into vengeance. She carried the legacy of forbidden wisdom, plants that healed and plants that killed. And in her hands, the kitchen became a weapon. This is not simply history. It is a map of hidden forces, of the ways control is built on lies, and of how even the most delicate pleasures can conceal death. Tonight, I am not just telling you a story. I am pulling you into a descent, a rabbit hole where the sweetest dessert becomes the deadliest weapon, and where forbidden truths rise like ghosts long buried. Now, lean in, because once you hear this, you cannot unhear it. You must understand the stage on which this act of vengeance was set. Henrico County, Virginia, 1847. A land of endless tobacco fields rolling like green oceans beneath the southern sun. At first glance, it looked like prosperity, order, even beauty. But peel back the gilded surface, and you find a kingdom of chains, a system so cruel, it had to disguise itself as tradition, as civilization. The plantation was not just a farm. It was a machine of control. Every brick, every acre, every drop of wealth was extracted from suffering. Behind the chandeliers and polished silver were screams muffled by walls, families torn apart at auction blocks, and children branded as future labor. The Carrington family, masters of Willowbrook Estate, embodied this empire. 3,000 acres, 200 enslaved souls, tobacco in their fields, blood on their hands. Colonel Edmund Carrington, the patriarch, was more than just a planter. He was an architect of corruption. His family had not only grown crops, but trafficked in human lives, building their fortune through the slave markets of Richmond. He served on councils, shared tables with politicians, whispered into the ears of lawmakers who shaped the South's destiny. His voice was not merely local. It echoed in Washington, carried by men who profited from the same system of bondage. These were not isolated tyrants. They were a network, bound together by wealth and secrecy. They dined together, laughed together, schemed together. Each dinner was not just a social gathering. It was a council of predators, deciding how to tighten the leash, how to maximize profit, how to crush the rising whispers of rebellion. Their unity was their power. Their arrogance was their weakness. And inside their kitchens, their parlors, their dining halls, stood the people they dismissed as invisible. People like Judith, trained from childhood to serve your appetites, to perfect the flavors that gave them pleasure, never realizing those same hands could one day serve them death. This is the paradox of corruption. It always believes itself untouchable. It builds palaces on foundations of suffering, confident no one can reach inside its walls. But corruption always forgets one thing. The closer you hold the oppressed, the closer you bring your own executioner. Remember this truth because it repeats itself through all of history. The systems that seem unbreakable rot from within, and when the reckoning comes, it often arrives from the last place power ever suspects. History wants you to believe Judith Henley was just a cook, but history lies. What lived inside Judith was not simply the skill of baking cakes or roasting meats. It was knowledge that had survived in whispers, passed down through outcasts, the oppressed, and the forgotten. As a child, Judith wandered beyond the rows of tobacco, into the woods that framed the plantation. There she met Ayana, an elderly Cherokee seamstress from a neighboring estate. Two women, both enslaved by different chains, both branded as less than human by a society drunk on its own lies. Their friendship was forbidden. If discovered, both could be whipped, sold, or worse. But some truths are worth the risk. Ayana carried with her the shattered fragments of a stolen world. Her people had been marched west in the Trail of Tears, stripped from their land, their medicines, their sacred knowledge. Yet Ayana refused to let it die. Beneath the cover of trees, she taught Judith the language of the earth, how leaves whispered of healing, how roots concealed power, how blossoms could carry both life and death in their petals. She revealed to Judith what no plantation owner could ever imagine their cook might know. Which mushrooms bent the mind into hallucination, which berries could stop a heart, which roots in small doses cured fever, but in larger amounts destroyed organs. This was medicine. This was poison. This was survival. For years, Judith carried this knowledge like a seed hidden in soil, dormant but alive. She cooked for the masters, served their endless appetites, never revealing that in her hands flour and honey were only part of the story. She knew how to turn sweetness into silence, flavor into a weapon. Understand this. The greatest threat to power is not open rebellion, but secret knowledge. That is why elites throughout history have burned books, silenced teachers, erased names. No, ledge is liberation. Knowledge is rebellion. Judith was no mere cook. She was a walking library of forbidden truths, and she knew that one day, the opportunity to use it would come. And it did. Because in the summer of 1846, violence tore through her world in a way that could never be undone. It was the day her children bled under the whip, and the seed Ayana planted in her heart burst into fire. It was a sweltering August morning, the air thick with heat and tension, when Judith's world was ripped apart. Her children, Rebecca, 4 years old, and Thomas, barely 2, had been chasing a butterfly near the big house. Innocent, joyful, unaware they had wandered across an invisible boundary drawn not in law, but in cruelty. James Hartwell, the overseer, spotted them. A man with pale eyes that seemed to savor pain, drunk already before noon. His rage erupted like a storm. He seized the children with hands that had broken men before, hands that saw no difference between wood to be cut or flesh to be whipped. Judith heard the screams from the kitchen and ran, but by the time she reached them, the nightmare had already begun. Thomas, a baby, barely walking, was held by his ankles, lashed with a riding crop, until his skin split in ribbons. Rebecca, his sister, tried to shield him. For that defiance, she was tied to a post and struck 20 times with a bullwhip. Each crack tore flesh. Each scream echoed into the air like an unholy hymn of agony. And then, Colonel Carrington arrived. The master, the man who could have stopped it with a single word. Instead, he watched, calm, almost amused. When Judith fell to her knees begging for mercy, he did not see a mother pleading for her children's lives. He saw property speaking out of turn. His voice was cold, casual, almost conversational. Perhaps these children have grown too comfortable here. Perhaps they need to learn their place. The meaning was clear. He would sell them. Broken, scarred, their bodies barely healed, he would sell them as damaged goods to another plantation, to be lost forever. Her husband Samuel tried to intervene, offering himself in their place. For his courage, Hartwell's boot left him unconscious in the dust, blood pooling beneath his skull. That day was Judith's breaking point. No law would protect her. No appeal to kindness would save her family. In that moment, something inside her snapped, not into despair, but into clarity. She saw the truth. These men believed themselves gods because they held life and death in their hands. But gods can bleed. Gods can die. That night, as she bound her children's wounds with herbs Ayana had once taught her to use, Judith made her decision. She would no longer bake for their pleasure. After the screams faded, after the blood dried on the soil, Judith Henley was not the same woman. The cook who once found joy in creating beauty from sugar and flour had been burned away. What remained was something colder, sharper, forged in rage and grief, honed by knowledge the masters could never imagine she carried. By day, she wore the mask. The obedient servant, head bent, hands busy, desserts flawless. The Carringtons and their guests praised her confections, never noticing the fire in her eyes when she turned away. They could not see that every smile she gave, every "yes, ma'am," every curtsy was a performance. Beneath it, she was studying them, their routines, their weaknesses, their appetites. By night, she became a shadow. When the plantation slept, Judith slipped into the woods. There, in silence, she returned to the teachings Ayana had once given her. She gathered plants with a precision born of desperation. Foxglove, whose leaves could stop a heart. Water hemlock, called the suicide root, fatal in drops too small to taste. Wild mushrooms that brought visions and death. She experimented in secret, blending, testing, learning how to hide bitterness with honey, how to mask venom with spice. Her kitchen became her laboratory. Each pie, each cake, each sauce was practice, not for flavor, but for concealment. Could the sharp edge of aconite vanish beneath cinnamon? Could the bitterness of oleander be softened with molasses? Every dish she prepared was a rehearsal for her true performance, one that would end in silence and death. But vengeance was not her only fuel. Something deeper grew inside her. The clarity that comes when a man finally sees the bars of his cage, when a woman finally knows the chains on her wrists will never fall unless she shatters them herself. Judith understood what few dared to admit. The master's power was not divine. It was fragile, built on fear and illusion. If she could strike at them, not one, not two, but all together, she would send a message far louder than any scream. And so, Judith stopped being just a cook. She became an avenger with sugar on her hands and venom in her heart. A woman preparing to write her vengeance not in words, but in poison. Fate has a cruel symmetry. For months, Judith waited, sharpening her knowledge like a blade in the dark. And then, in September of 1847, the perfect moment arrived. Colonel Carrington announced a dinner at Willowbrook Estate, a grand gathering of the county's most powerful planters. 8 men in total, each one tied to the machinery of slavery, each one complicit in the suffering of her family, each one about to taste their own downfall. These dinners were more than social events. They were councils of control. Behind polished silver and overflowing wine, plans were made that decided the futures of thousands. Market strategies, patrol schedules, new measures to crush rebellion, all discussed under the disguise of friendship and laughter. To the outside world, it was refinement. To Judith, it was a tribunal of predators. The preparations were elaborate. Servants scrubbed the marble floors until they gleamed. Candles were polished, chandeliers lit, decanters filled with imported brandy. Judith oversaw the kitchen, her hands steady, her voice calm, her expression unreadable. To anyone watching, she was the model of loyal service. But inside her chest, her heart beat with a rhythm that was not fear. It was resolve. She chose her weapons carefully. Not knives, not fire, but sweetness. The dessert would be her battlefield. She prepared honey cakes infused with herbs gathered from the woods, their flavors layered so perfectly no bitterness remained. To the masters, it would taste divine. To their bodies, it would be fatal. As the hour approached, Judith watched them arrive. The clatter of carriage wheels, the laughter of wives, the booming voices of men drunk on their own invincibility. They entered the hall in silk and velvet, their boots echoing against marble floors, unaware they were stepping into their graves. Carrington himself was radiant with pride, welcoming, his guests with a smile, boasting of his land, his wealth, his slaves. His words rolled across the room, blind to the fact that the very woman who ensured his reputation for the finest cuisine in Virginia had already written his obituary with her hands. The table was set. The masters gathered. Their glasses clinked, and Judith, silent in the shadows, waited for the moment when sweetness would turn to silence and laughter to screams. The dinner stretched long into the night, the dining hall glowing with candlelight, laughter spilling like wine across the polished wood. Judith moved silently among them, refilling glasses, carrying platters, answering to every command with a bowed head. But in her mind, each passing moment was a countdown. The main courses had been cleared, roast duck glazed with molasses, ham cured in smoke, bowls of candied yam so rich they glistened beneath the flames. The men ate greedily, boasting of harvests, wages, and women. But Judith's eyes were fixed not on their words, but on what came next. At last the colonel struck his glass for silence. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice dripping with pride, "as always, Willowbrook shall end its feasts with the finest confections in Henrico, prepared by none other than my Judith." A servant wheeled in the silver trays, and there they were, small honey cakes, golden as the candlelight, dusted with sugar so fine it shimmered like frost. Their scent was sweet, floral, irresistible. Judith set them before each man with steady hands, her gaze never faltering. The room hushed for a moment as forks clinked against porcelain. Then came the first bite, the crunch of crust, the softness of honey melting across tongues. Murmurs of delight filled the hall. "Exquisite. Perfect. The best yet." Judith stood in the shadows, her heart a hammer inside her chest. To the masters it was just dessert. To her it was justice, laced with silence. Minutes passed. The laughter swelled again, wine glasses refilled. But then, the first shift. Carrington paused mid-sentence, his hand trembling around his goblet. Across the table, Andrew Whitefield, a planter from Prince George, pressed a hand to his stomach, his face tightening in confusion. At first the others laughed. Too much wine, they joked. A spoiled stomach, perhaps. But then Whitefield gasped, clutching at his throat, eyes wide as his body lurched forward. A fork clattered to the floor. Another man coughed violently, red-faced, choking on air that would not come. The laughter died. One by one, the masters began to change. Their boasts turned into groans, their arrogance into panic. Plates overturned, wine spilled across the tablecloth like blood. Carrington's voice cracked as he demanded order, but his words drowned beneath the chorus of agony. And Judith? She stood silent, watching, unblinking. For the first time in her life, she saw them not as gods, but as men. Fragile, mortal, and dying by her hand. Panic swept the dining hall like wildfire. One moment the masters were boasting of profits, the next they were clutching at their throats, retching, gasping for breath that would not come. The polished silver and crystal chandeliers could not mask the primal sounds of men unraveling. The choking, the screams, the desperate scrape of chairs against the floor. Andrew Whitefield fell first. His body convulsed, his face drained of color, lips foaming as he clawed at his chest. The others recoiled, horrified. Yet within seconds, 2 more joined him. Jonathan Hale slumped forward onto his plate, blood trickling from his nose, while Samuel Price vomited violently across the fine linen tablecloth. Carrington, the master of Willowbrook, staggered to his feet, fury twisting his face. "What trick is this?" he roared, though his voice cracked, betraying the poison already coursing through his veins. His hand reached for Judith but faltered. The strength that once commanded whips and guns now drained away with every poisoned heartbeat. Around him, the others collapsed. Their silk coats were stained with bile, their boots scraping against the marble floor as they writhed like fish pulled from water. One man crawled toward the door, his fingers leaving bloody smears on the polished wood, before his body stiffened and fell still. The wives screamed, their cries echoing through the halls. Servants froze in terror, too afraid to move, too shocked to intervene. But Judith did not scream. She stood motionless, her dark eyes calm, her breath steady. For years she had been forced to kneel before these men. Now, for the first time, they knelt before her, on the ground, writhing in their own weakness. Carrington's rage gave way to desperation. His eyes locked on Judith's, wild and disbelieving. "You!" he croaked, spittle at his lips. "What have you done?" Judith did not answer. Words were unnecessary. The truth was written in their failing bodies, in the silence that crept closer with each passing second. One by one the masters fell. The laughter, the arrogance, the false divinity of men who believed themselves untouchable, all dissolved into whimpers and death rattles. And Judith, standing over them, felt no fear, only justice, only silence. The grand dining hall of Willowbrook was unrecognizable. The polished table, once glittering with silver and wine, was now a battlefield of death. Plates overturned, goblets shattered. The sweet smell of honey cakes mingled with the acrid stench of vomit and blood. The chandeliers still glowed above, their golden light falling upon bodies that no longer moved. The laughter of the masters, gone. Their booming voices, their commands, their cruelty, gone. What remained was silence, heavy, suffocating. Judith stood at the head of the table, her hands folded before her, her breathing calm. For years she had been the unseen figure in the background of their pleasures, the hands that fed their indulgence. Now, she was the last figure standing. The room was hers. The wives huddled in corners, sobbing, their silks stained with fear. Some looked at Judith with horror, others with a strange, trembling awe. The servants lingered in the shadows, wide-eyed, their bodies taut with dread. None dared to speak, none dared to move. For what had happened was unthinkable. A single woman, enslaved, had brought the masters of Henrico to their knees. Judith's children crept into the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Rebecca clung to her mother's skirt, her little body trembling, while Thomas stared at the bodies with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Judith knelt and pulled them close, her hands gentle as she whispered words they would not forget. "You are free." But even in that moment of triumph, danger loomed. Judith knew this silence could not last. The plantation would wake, news would spread like fire across the county. Soldiers would come. Retaliation would be brutal, not only for her, but for every enslaved soul who dared to dream of freedom. And yet, she felt no regret. Fear had lived inside her for too long. Fear of the whip, fear of the auction block, fear of a world where her Sikhs, Hildren's lives were never their own. Tonight, fear died with the masters. In the stillness, Judith stood taller than she ever had before. Around her lay the corpses of men who once thought themselves gods. Above her, the chandeliers flickered, casting shadows that seemed to bow before her. For the first time in her life, Judith was not a servant. She was a legend in the making. By dawn, the story had already begun to spread, first as whispers among the servants, then as frantic cries spilling into the streets of Henrico County. 8 plantation masters, dead in a single night. Not by duel, nor by fever, but by the hand of a slave. The South trembled. Word traveled fast, carried on wagon wheels and hushed conversations at taverns. In Richmond, planters locked their doors, their voices tight with fear. In Charleston and Savannah, letters warned of the Willowbrook poisoner, a phantom figure whispered about in the language of terror. For decades, slave revolts had been the nightmare of the South. But this was different. This was invisible. No burning torches, no uprising in the fields. Just sweetness on a plate. Death hidden in honey. If a slave could do this, any slave could. If Judith could kill 8 men with sugar and herbs, who could say what others might do? Trust dissolved like salt in water. Every servant's hand became suspect. Every meal, a potential death sentence. The response was swift, brutal. Laws tightened overnight. Enslaved people were forbidden to cook unsupervised, forbidden to handle herbs, forbidden to touch the master's food. Kitchens became cages patrolled by armed overseers. Punishments multiplied. Whippings, hangings, the spectacle of terror renewed, all meant to remind the enslaved that power still belonged to the masters. But fear had already taken root in white hearts, and hope had already begun to flicker in black ones. In hushed corners of slave quarters, Judith's name was spoken not with dread, but with reverence. Some said she had fled into the swamps, untouchable. Others swore she'd been taken by spirits, transformed into something more than human. The details blurred, but the message remained. The masters could bleed. They could die. Judith herself was never found. Whether she escaped into the Fortune ests of Virginia, vanished along the Underground Railroad, or was swallowed by the silence of history, no one could say for certain. But her act lived on like a ghost, haunting every dinner table from Georgia to Louisiana. The South had tried to bury her in silence. Instead, she became a legend, a whisper that spread in the dark. A whisper that said, "The gods of the South are not immortal. History has a way of silencing voices it cannot control." The courts never recorded Judith Henley's fate. No trial, no official confession, no gallows marked her end. The archives simply dissolve into silence, as if she were erased, as if she had never existed. But legends have longer lives than paper. In the quarters, her story grew like wildfire. They called her the Sweet Widow, the Poisoned Hand, and sometimes simply Mother Justice. Around campfires, enslaved men would whisper how Judith had slipped through the trees, vanishing into the swamps where spirits shielded her. Children, barely old enough to speak, were taught her name like a psalm, a promise that one day even the mighty could fall. For the masters, her ghost was a nightmare they could not kill. They locked their pantries, banned herbs, stationed armed men in kitchens. Yet still, at every meal, suspicion lingered. Every sip of wine, every bite of cake carried the taste of fear. Judith had infected more than their bodies. She had poisoned their certainty, shattered their sense of invincibility. Among the enslaved, the myth grew sharper, deeper. They said Judith had not simply vanished. She had become something beyond human. Some whispered she joined the Maroons, the hidden bands of escaped slaves who carved lives out of the wilderness. Others swore she walked with the spirits of Ayana's Cherokee ancestors, her hands now guided by forces older than America itself. And in the secret songs sung at night, her act became more than revenge. It became ritual. a story carried in rhythm and rhyme, hidden in coded language so overseers could not hear. Her name was a weapon, her story a shield, her desert a prophecy. Judith Henley, enslaved cook turned phantom of vengeance, lived on in the imaginations of those who needed her most. To the white masters, she was a ghost with a knife of honey. To the enslaved, she was proof. Proof that power could be broken, proof that terror could be answered, proof that justice could take shape in the hands of the oppressed. And whether she was alive, dead, or something in between, she had already become immortal. Listen carefully. What happened to Judith Henley is not just a story about revenge. It's a story about control, about who decides what gets remembered and what gets buried. For more than a century, the night 8 plantation masters died was explained away as food poisoning. Convenient, clean, a story that left the masters still looking untouchable while erasing the agency of the woman who outwitted them. The official narrative stripped Judith of her weapon, her intelligence, her defiance. Why? Because her story was too dangerous to survive. Understand this. History is not neutral. History is curated, censored, sterilized. What you read in textbooks is not always the truth. It is the version of truth that those in power can afford for you to believe. Judith's act wasn't forgotten by accident. It was suppressed deliberately, because a slave woman poisoning her masters shattered the myth of white invincibility. It made every enslaved man, woman, and child dangerous in the eyes of the elite. If her story spread too far, it would ignite rebellion. It would inspire resistance. It would remind the oppressed of their own hidden power. This is the psychological war you were never told about. Power doesn't only chain bodies. It chains memory. It chains stories. It buries proof that the powerless are not truly powerless. But fragments survive. A hidden journal discovered in 1994. Whispered folktales passed through generations. Unmarked graves that align with records of that September night. Enough evidence to stitch the story back together and expose the lie. And here's the truth they don't want you to see. Judith was not unique. Across the South, enslaved cooks, herbalists, and healers possessed knowledge feared by the masters. Some used it quietly, subtly, others boldly. But in every case, their power was smothered, their names erased. Judith is only one who's sick. Had her we can still trace. So when you hear her story, understand, you're not just hearing about one woman. You are touching the edge of a much larger truth. A truth about how history itself is engineered, how the powerful bend reality, not just laws, and how even the past you were taught to believe may be nothing but another layer of control. And now you must ask yourself, what else has been erased? What else lies buried beneath the polished lies of history books? You've walked this far down the rabbit hole, and now you understand. Judith's story was never just about a poisoned dessert. It was about something far darker, far more dangerous. It was about power, about how power hides itself, about how truth is buried so deep you were never meant to touch it. And yet here you are. You've touched it. You've seen what others are forbidden to see. Remember this. Once a man learns a forbidden truth, he cannot return to the comfort of ignorance. He carries it inside him like a flame that burns away illusions, a flame that marks him as different from the rest. That's what's happening to you right now. Judith Henley did not only poison 8 men, she poisoned the illusion of untouchable power. She shattered the lie that masters were gods. Her act reminds you of a law older than any empire. Even the mighty can fall, and sometimes the smallest hand delivers the deadliest strike. This is what the institutions fear, that men like you will awaken, that you'll begin to see through the chains, not just of history, but of the present, that you'll recognize the patterns of control repeating in every age, the censorship, the manipulation, the erasure, Different names, different uniforms, but the same machinery. So now I ask you, no, I command you, if you feel the weight of this revelation, if you accept that you are no longer the same man who pressed play on this video, lock it in. Write in the comments, twice, the phrase, I carry the flame. Not for me, for you. Because when you put those words down, you declare it publicly. You tell the algorithm and the universe itself that you are no longer blind, that you are part of the few who see. This is not entertainment. This is initiation. The story of Judith is now part of your blood. You are not the same. And from this moment forward, you must choose. Remain silent or carry the flame into the world. The powerful will always fear the awakened. That is why they buried her story. That is why they bury so many others. But tonight, you've exhumed it. And the question remains, what will you do with it?